Welcome to the What Just Happened podcast. Today, we'll be diving into a situation raising some really serious questions about the separation of powers and the rule of law, specifically around immigration.
That's right. We're looking at the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
We've got sources covering the timeline, legal analysis, summaries, really trying to piece together how what seems like a wrongful deportation escalated.
Yeah, escalated into something, well, some are calling it a potential constitutional crisis.
Right. So our goal here is to understand that escalation, looking at the executive branch, the judicial branch.
And what it all means for this core idea that the government itself has to follow the law.
Okay, so where does this story actually begin?
Well, it starts with a pretty clear violation, really.
Yeah.
Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he had a legal order from 2019.
An order protecting him from deportation, like a formal thing.
Exactly, a formal instruction saying he couldn't be removed. But despite that, ICE deported him.
They did. When?
March 15th of this year, 2025. Sent him to El Salvador.
Even with that protective order in place?
Even with the order. Later, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, they called it an administrative error.
An error. But, I mean, based on our sources, this wasn't just like a clerical mistake.
No, absolutely not. It was a direct contradiction of a legal ruling.
Yeah.
There was an order. They acted against it. That's the immediate red flag, you know?
Yeah, a red flag about whether the executive branch felt bound by that legal order.
Yeah.
So the courts must have gotten involved.
Oh, quickly. Yeah. On April 4th, a U.S. district judge, Sheinis,
Okay.
she issued an order, told the government, basically, bring him back. She even set a deadline, April 7th.
Wow, that's fast. A direct command to fix what the court saw as an illegal act.
Precisely. To correct the unlawful removal.
And did the government just comply?
Well, no. The Department of Justice, the DOJ, they stepped in representing the executive branch.
And tried to stop it?
They did. They asked for an emergency stay, essentially asking a higher court to pause Judge Sheinis' order, give them more time, or maybe overturn it.
Okay, so they challenged her order. What happened with that?
It went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Really? The highest court?
Yep. And on April 10th, the Supreme Court, they refused the stay. They let Judge Sheinis' order stand.
So the Supreme Court effectively said, no, the judge is right. This needs to happen.
Exactly. And experts point out the court was clear. DHS had to help get him released from wherever he was being held and treat him as if he'd never been deported. It underscored that the initial deportation was seen as unlawful.
That seems pretty definitive then, legally speaking. He should be on his way back.
You would certainly think so. But this is where it gets really concerning.
How so?
Just a few days later, April 14th, the president of El Salvador is actually visiting the White House.
Okay.
And during that visit, President Bukele states that he won't hand Abrego Garcia over.
El Salvador's president says this.
Yes. And critically, President Trump, who's right there with him, apparently doesn't contradict him, doesn't push back.
Huh. Interesting timing. And silence.
Very. And then, fast forward just a bit to April 23rd, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, makes a public statement.
And what does she say?
She says, quite directly, that Abrego Garcia is not coming back to our country.
Wait, what? After the Supreme Court decision?
After the Supreme Court let the order stand, yes.
How can she say that? What's the justification?
Her argument is that only El Salvador can release him now that he's there. So the U.S. government is essentially claiming its hands are tied.
But they're the ones who sent him there, against a court order.
Precisely. It looks an awful lot like the executive branch is using the actions of a foreign government, actions potentially enabled by the U.S. deportation itself, as a shield to avoid complying with the U.S. court order.
Doesn't that just fundamentally challenge the court's authority? It feels like creating a loophole using foreign policy.
That's the core issue everyone's looking at now. Is the executive branch placing itself above the judiciary in this instance?
So how did Judge Sheinis respond to that? To the Attorney General basically defying her order, the one the Supreme Court upheld?
Well, she responded forcefully. On April 22nd, she issued a written opinion accusing the administration of willful and intentional noncompliance.
Willful and intentional.
Yes.
That's strong language from a judge, isn't it?
Extremely strong. It indicates she sees this not as an accident or a misunderstanding, but as deliberate defiance.
Wow. And did she do anything beyond using strong words?
Oh, yes. She ordered depositions.
That's sworn testimony, right? Under oath.
Exactly. And document discovery, demanding the government turn over internal documents and communications related to the case and their efforts, or lack thereof, to bring him back.
So she's digging deeper, forcing them to show their work. essentially.
Right. It signals she might be heading towards holding them in contempt of court for disobeying her order.
And it gets worse, doesn't it? Didn't she say something about falsehoods?
She did. She found that the DOJ lawyers arguing the case had presented falsehoods to the court.
Falsehoods, like lying.
That's the clear implication. And she said they acted in bad faith in refusing their discovery obligations, avoiding handing over information. She even said their objections about the Supreme Court's order were based on a false premise.
So she's accusing the government's lawyers of not just resisting, but actively misleading the court.
That's precisely what the judge's findings suggest. She specifically threw out their claim that information about his detention in El Salvador was some kind of privileged state secret.
Ah, the old national security argument.
She wasn't buying it in this context. She also criticized their legal objections as being vague, boilerplate, nonspecific, calling it deliberate evasion.
So just trying to gum up the works. Did she pause this discovery process at all?
There was a very brief pause granted on April 23rd, but it came with a significant string attached.
Which was?
Daily status updates. The judge demanded the government report back to her every single day on their progress or lack thereof.
Okay, so she's keeping the pressure on, constant scrutiny.
Absolutely. She is not letting this go.
This whole situation, then, it feels much bigger than just Mr. Garcia's case, as important as that is.
It really does. Legal experts are watching this very closely. They're saying it's become a crucial test.
A test of what?
A test of whether the executive branch considers itself bound by court orders, particularly in the immigration context. And as you mentioned earlier, some are framing it as a potential constitutional crisis.
That term again, a serious clash between the branches of government.
Exactly. Because if the executive branch can successfully defy a direct court order, one that's even been implicitly backed by the Supreme Court, well, what does that mean for the rule of law itself? What's the limit?
And what about accountability? Those DOJ lawyers Judge Sheinis criticized. Could they face personal consequences for presenting falsehoods?
It's possible. Our sources mention potential disciplinary actions, maybe sanctions from within the DOJ itself, although, some analysts doubt how likely that is in this political climate.
Right. Internal accountability might be tricky.
Or, perhaps more likely, referrals to the state bar associations that license lawyers. Lying to a court is a major ethical violation. There could also be investigations by the Office of Professional Responsibility within DOJ.
And Judge Sheinis, what power does she ultimately have here? Contempt.
That seems to be the path she's on. She's given the government deadlines to provide information or legally justify withholding it. If they fail to comply, she could issue a formal finding of contempt. That could involve fines or potentially even other sanctions, though jailing executive branch officials is extremely rare and constitutionally complex.
What about the government's main defense? This idea that, we can't force El Salvador to release him. How is the court handling that?
The judge seems to be reframing it. It's less about the U.S. court ordering El Salvador around and more about the U.S. court ordering the U.S. government to take every possible action within its power to rectify its own unlawful action, the deportation.
Ah, I see. So the focus is on the U.S. government's obligation to fix its mistake, even if it requires diplomatic effort.
Precisely. It challenges the idea that potential diplomatic hurdles can simply excuse noncompliance with the domestic court order stemming from the government's own illegal conduct. It's a fundamental clash over responsibility.
Okay, let's try and summarize this because it's a lot. We have Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Had legal protection against deportation.
Was deported anyway by ICE March 15th. DHS called it an error.
Judge Sheinis ordered his return by April 7th. The Supreme Court let that order stand on April 10th.
But then El Salvador's president says no release, with President Trump present, and the Attorney General states publicly on April 23rd he's not coming back, citing El Salvador.
And Judge Sheinis responds forcefully, accusing the administration of willful and intentional noncompliance, falsehoods, bad faith, and is pushing towards contempt while demanding daily updates.
And as we record this, April 23rd, 2025, he's still in El Salvador.
Still detained, despite the clear legal rulings demanding his return.
It leaves us really grappling with this core question. What actually happens when the executive branch seems to openly defy the judiciary?
Yeah, what teeth do court orders really have if the branch responsible for enforcement refuses? And maybe more importantly, what are the long-term consequences for our entire system of checks and balances if this kind of defiance is allowed to stand?
This is clearly a story that is still very much unfolding.
Absolutely. And the outcome whatever it may be, will likely tell us a lot about the real-world strength of the separation of powers in the United States today. It definitely leaves you wondering about the resilience of those constitutional guardrails.